As this is a reader insert fanfiction, all instances of YN will be replaced with a name for ease of recording. Safeguard, a Witcher fanfiction, written by The Oracle. Cirei sat on her bed with an array of items from her bag laid out in front of her. She took note of which of her herbs need replenishment, and her eyes kept glancing back at her swords. For a moment, her eyes lingered on them. The shine of the steel in the candlelight matched those of her eyes, and unbeknownst to her, her lips curled at the edges. She picked up one of her swords and laid it on her lap. Her finger traced over the polished blade, the hilt and the blade both tended to and in pristine condition, as if unused. The door of the room swung open, and she perked up in an instant. She turned to see Geralt beeline to his bed, where his items were left, not bothered to spare her a glance. "So," she spoke up, "what are we dealing with?" Geralt carried on with his task, with no indication if he heard a word of what she had said. Cirei huffed out, and with her eyes still trained on him, she skipped over to his side of the room and leaned her head in front of Geralt to obscure his view from his bag. Geralt sidestepped away and didn't bother to look at her. It impressed her how determined he was to deny her presence in the room. "You can't keep this up for long, you know." Geralt paused his actions. He stared off into his bag, his expression blank to not betray his thoughts. A moment passed. "You're not going on this job." And he continued to rummage through his things. Cirei shook her head, confused.
Excuse me?"
"You're not going on this job," he repeated, eyes fixed on his things.
"Hold on. You said if I laid off some of the past jobs, I will be able to go on this one."
She stood up straighter, her hand on her hip in a wide stance.
"As I see it, Geralt, that means I am allowed to go on this job."
For the first time since he entered the room, his eyes met hers. The fire behind her eyes, a flame that Geralt is all too familiar with. He dragged his eyes off of hers and landed on her hand, and to the wrappings around her wrist, to be exact, caused by the last time she went on a job with him. She followed his line of sight, and her shoulders slumped down before she met his eyes again. "You can't shield me from danger, Geralt. There will always be something around the corner." She moved to place a hand on his shoulder and stared into his eyes. "Let me help you." He pulled his eyes from hers once more, and she sighed, took her hand off of his shoulder, and stepped away.
"Something to keep in mind, Geralt?"
He glanced up at her.
"I am only asking you out of common courtesy. Whether you like it or not, I am tagging along. It's simply up to you whether I'm walking beside you or trailing behind."
She stared down Geralt and challenged him to tell her she can't come once more. He averted his eyes from hers and went back to his things. "Okay."
"Wait, what was that?"
She leaned forward and feigned not being able to hear him. "I said you can come." She cleared her throat, fought back a smile, and nodded. She pumped her fist out in celebration when she turned away. Geralt shook his head at her. He went back to his preparations and noted, to keep an eye on her throughout this job. Cirei and Geralt stood back to back in a cavern, surrounded by the still bodies of the creatures they fought for the better part of the day. Cirei laughed out in exhaustion and leaned onto Geralt for support.
"Well, that was fun. Not as tough as I expected it to be, but fun nonetheless."
Geralt smiled at his friend, but it faded in an instant. A sound rang out in the cavern and grabbed Geralt's attention. Cirei must have not caught the noise and questioned the Witcher's change in demeanor. Geralt's eyes darted from one corner of the cavern to another. He surveyed the area for whatever they have missed on their way in. "These creatures," he stated. "These aren't the only thing residing here." As if signaled by Geralt, a dark blur flew out of the shadows and shot towards Cirei. She raised her sword in defense, but the creature swung low and caused her to drop her weapon and left her wide open. The beast took advantage of the weak defense, clawed at Cirei, and lifted her into the air. Geralt charged at the beast, picked up Cirei's weapon and threw it at the winged beast. The sword impaled the creature and it thrashed in pain. Before it could drop her, she reached up towards the weapon and used her weight to carve her sword out of the creature's body. Her land was not graceful, but she managed to land on her feet for a second before she collapsed onto the floor. Her sword dropped to the ground beside her, and she pulled her arm to her chest as she cradled it in pain. With the creature somehow not killed, Geralt raced to Saray and stood between her and the beast. Everything slowed down when Geralt looked behind him towards Saray. She curled onto herself in pain, blood trickled down her forearm, and her shoulders shuddered with every strained breath she took. Geralt's conscience weighed with every observed detail. Geralt was so focused on his guilt that he was caught off guard when Saray's head snapped up towards him, eyes wide, and then yelled something he couldn't hear. Before he could react, she charged up and shoved Geralt to the ground as the creature from before swept low to attack Geralt.
"I said, watch out, damn it!"
She glared from on top of him through gritted teeth, the weight of her body pushed down on her arm. As she glanced up behind her, the creature swept down on them once more, and she rolled to her side, grabbed her sword with her non-injured arm, and used the momentum of her body to swing up at the creature. The swing missed, but it gave Geralt enough time to get on his feet and land a fatal blow on the creature. It dropped to the ground, dust scattered up around it, as the body laid still as the corpse it is now. Geralt went back to Saray, her sword driven into the ground and used to prop herself up. Geralt placed his hand on her shoulder, and through uneven breaths, she glanced up at him.
"Where would you be without me, huh?"
Geralt's head fell to his chest as he huffed out a laugh at his friend's ability to joke at unusual times. At the sight of her arm, he brought his pack out in a hurry. Saray kept her eyes trained on his every move, a much-needed distraction from the current state of her arm. He took out his things one at a time, a constant rhythm, almost like clockwork. Her gaze drifted off of his hands and to his eyes. Sweat dripped down his brow, which he furrowed in his concentrated state. His eyes darted in search of the necessary items within his pack, and behind those eyes, the things Saray saw behind those eyes, hurt her more than the slashed arm. She raised her hand to reach out to Geralt, but a wave of nausea hit her and threw her off balance. She fell forward onto Geralt, her head resting on his shoulder, and he instinctively placed a hand up to assist her.
"Hey,"
she said, her voice weak.
"Don't worry, all right?"
Geralt stiffened up beneath her at her words.
"No, none of that."
She propped herself up with her okay arm on Geralt's shoulder and looked at the man in the eyes. His eyes stared shattered, concerned, and consumed by guilt.
"We're getting out of this alive. With an injury, yes, but alive. And no one is to blame. Except for that fuck."
She gestured to the dead corpse that lay a few feet away from them. Geralt's lips curled up in a smile, but his eyes still carried hurt from Saray's state. She wished she could take it away. She leaned her head down, her forehead met Geralt's, and she looked into his eyes.
"We have each other, all right? I got your back, and you got mine. Nothing's going to change that."
Geralt stared back and scanned her eyes. The fire he saw earlier that day still shone bright as ever, and that itself brought some comfort to him, and he couldn't help but nod at her words.
"I'll be needing more than that, Geralt. I'm not saying these things for the fun of it."
Geralt huffed out a laugh. "All right."
"Good."
She dropped her head back onto Geralt's shoulder once more.
"Now let's get this arm dealt with, yeah? This place is beginning to stink, and I would rather not stay here longer than I should."
Geralt held Saray for a short while before he went back to his pack and began to tend to her wound. He was careful with his actions, as to not hurt her more than she already is. And while Geralt carried on with his work, Saray could see the slight smile Geralt held, and couldn't help but mimic, as she thought,
"Yeah, we'll both be just fine."
Thank you for listening to my podfic. If you liked it, consider supporting me on Ko-fi, or follow me on my various social platforms linked down below.